Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We would like to extend a very warm welcome to each one of you at the nice global conclave from the labs of the beautiful Himalayas, where the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is located. The think tank was established in the month of February in the year 2016. It undertakes independent research in the field of international relations, foreign policy, security studies, and development. NICE has 4 research centers: China Studies, Neighborhood Studies, Non-Traditional Security Studies, and Security and Strategic Studies. The Institute focuses on 8 research topics: climate change and energy, global governance, sustainable development and smart cities, refugee and migration, China's Belt and Road Initiative, border and transboundary water politics, Indo-Pacific affairs, disaster management, and international economy and development. Previously, NICE has had the opportunity to host distinguished speakers from all around the globe.
It was a great pleasure inviting me to speak here at NICE.
It's a real pleasure to be able to speak with all of you.
But thank you anyway, and I certainly admire the work that you're doing.
I'm very happy to be with you all.
NICE Global Conclave is a flagship event of Nepal Institute of International Cooperation and Engagement. The theme of the 3-day conference is connecting Nepal to the world by bringing leaders, diplomats, business leaders, and scholars from all around the globe. The objective of the conclave is to introduce Nepal to the world and at the same time update the Nepalese policy makers and experts about the fast-changing geopolitics, which will help Nepal reshape its foreign policy and to achieve its national goal. This is session 15 of the conference, and to chair and moderate this session, it's a real pleasure to have Dr. Pramod Jaiswal here with us. Dr. Pramod Jaiswal is the Research Director at Nepal Institute of International Cooperation and Engagement. He is a visiting fellow at the Sandia National Laboratories, New Mexico, US, and Senior Fellow at the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies, New Delhi. Dr. Jaiswal has been a regular and visiting faculty at different universities of Nepal and China. Without any further ado, I request the chair to take over.
Thank you. Professor Dr. G. John Ikenberry and distinguished participants, welcome to the 15th session of NICE Global Conclave. This is a special session on the US, China, and the future of liberal international order. Professor Ikenberry, it's our privilege to have you at NICE. We are really honored for providing us this opportunity. We'd like to thank us for providing your valuable time for today's discussion. Professor Ikenberry needs no introduction. However, let me briefly introduce Professor Ikenberry. Professor G. John Ikenberry is the Albert G. Milbank Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University in the Department of Politics and Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. He's also the co-director of Princeton Center for International Security Studies and Global Eminence Scholar at Kyung-Hee University in Seoul. Professor Ikenberry was a visiting fellow at Oxford University and American Academy of Arts and Science. He has authored 8 books, most recently A World Safe for Democracy, Liberal Internationalism and the Crisis of Global Order, and Liberal Leviathan, The Origin, Crisis, and Transformation of the American System. His book, After Victory, Institutions, Strategic Restraint and the Rebuilding of Order After Major Wars, published by Princeton in 2001, won the 2002 Schroeder Jervis Award presented by the American Political Science Association for the book in International History and Politics. Professor Ikenberry also served as a member of the policy planning staff at the State Department and a member of the Council of Foreign Relations Task Force on US-European relations. In a recent survey of international relations scholars, Ikenberry was ranked 10th in the scholar who have produced the best work in the field of international relations in past 2 decades, and ranked 8th in scholars who have produced the most interesting work in past 5 years. This program is streaming live on Facebook, and we'd like to request all our participants to share the video so that on their social media so that maximum can benefit from the discussion. Please drop your questions in the Zoom chat or on the Facebook Live. Professor Ikenberry would like to request you to make your presentation in 20-25 minutes or maybe 30 minutes, which will be followed by question and answers. So over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Jaiswal. It's really great to see you and to be part of this wonderful conference, and to congratulate NICE, the Nepal Institute, for your extraordinary efforts to bring the world together and to talk about the great issues of the day. I've not been to Nepal, but my son actually spent a year in Nepal after high school, and studying culture and religion in your wonderful country. And in fact, it changed his life. He's in college now studying world religion. So Nepal has an important place in my family's history, if you will. And so it's an honor to be here today. I want to talk today about world order and American and Chinese struggle over world order. And I want to really begin with a kind of an American view, a look at the American experience at building world order over the last century, and how that American career of order building has now come to a point where it faces a rising China that has its own vision of international order. So I want to get to that through about 25 minutes of discussion of the American-led post-war liberal international order. Now that order that we date back to 1945 is clearly in trouble. Many people would say it's breaking down, but more broadly speaking, we have a kind of global retreat from cooperation, a kind of crisis of lost confidence in collective solutions to common problems. We seem to be at a kind of world historical turning point. You can imagine many different types of international order that might be emerging. All the big issues are on the table for debate. As scholars of international relations, we are going back and asking the most basic questions that our scholarly field asks. What is the nature of international order? Can liberal democracies make a comeback and solve their problems? Can you reconcile capitalism and democracy? What is the nature of the struggle between liberal democracy and authoritarian types of states? How will that struggle unfold? And for me, and in the book that I've just written, A World Safe for Democracy, I asked the question, how can we think about the liberal international approach to world order? What is the ground on which we can plant the flag of liberal international order building, which is to say, order building focused on the cooperative construction of mutually agreeable rules and institutions for solving common problems anchored in cooperation among liberal democracies. So I want to talk about all those issues, but I would just say that we are often finding ourselves talking about different crises in international politics. We're not always asking the same questions and focused on the same problems. And I think that the reason why that is that there are at least 3 global crises that are unfolding simultaneously, that are in each in their own way making governance, cooperative governance at the global level very difficult. One is what I will call the crisis of geopolitics. This is very familiar to students of international relations. This is the long-term shift in the distribution of power. This is something that we trace over the centuries, the rise and fall of great powers, the struggles over the rules and institutions of international order. And today we are watching what many people consider to be a global power transition where the US and the so-called Western powers are in some sense losing ground and giving way to China, perhaps by itself or with a larger coalition of non-Western states, seeking to have their moment for building international order. And so power transitions, as we know, are very fraught moments. They are moments when competition, miscalculation, dangerous foreign policy, aggression, insecurity, all generate opportunities or dangers, if you will, for miscalculation and for conflict. But today's power transition is even worse than you might say that the past ones have been, because it's not just a power transition from Great Britain to the United States, or from France to Great Britain, or Germany to Great Britain. It's a transition from a Western democracy to an Asian non-democracy, each anchored in very different civilizations. So it's a triple power transition. It's a transition from the United States to China, from the West to the East, and from liberal democracy to authoritarian statist polity. So those are three layers of power transition, each with their own complexities and dangers. And it is something that is unfolding over decades. It's not something that will easily go away. It's something that will be with us really for our entire lifetime. So my first message today really is we're going to have to be used to struggle, to competition, to these kind of dangers, and see where we can manage them. The second crisis of global order is what I would call the crisis of modernity. And this is something that is equally important and profound in its implications. And this is simply the intensification of economic, security, and environmental interdependence. This is the arrival of the anthropocene era, the new moment in world historical time when human communities are impacting nature in a way that is transforming the environment in which we're living in, creating ever more complex cascades of interdependence. And these are deeply rooted in what we call modernity, in the rise of industrialism, of science, technology, the way in which the human species has revolutionized knowledge, technology, and the ability to do things, to act on nature. And it's creating ever more dangers of our common existence. We see it obviously most dramatically in the COVID-19 pandemic, but we see it equally profoundly in the climate change crisis that is unfolding. We see it in the transformation and spread of weapons of mass destruction. And we are all looking for ways to manage this interdependence. This is not a struggle between East and West. This is a struggle between humans and nature, between the ability to manage technology and modernity for human purposes. And so even if we weren't in a power transition, we would be trying to manage our common problems and finding ourselves having to dream up new ways for governing the world in this environment. The third crisis is what I'll call the crisis of liberal democracy. This is something that we in the United States can feel very, very deeply. And I apologize for giving an American view today, but of course in the United States, we have seen our own liberal democracy put to the test, and it's not over with. Yes, we had an experience with a would-be authoritarian leader, Donald Trump, who did not respect the rule of law, who was not committed to the norms of liberal democracy, and we saw how difficult it was to get rid of him. And he's not gone entirely yet. But this is not just an American story, it's a story we see around the world of democracies that seem to be on the march after the end of the Cold War, after 1989, are finding managing their open, accountable governments, the rule of law, the freedom of the press, these values that we hold dear, difficult to manage in the context of rising inequality, growing conflict between cultural, subcultural groups, ethnic, racial animosity. Very difficult for open societies committed to the rule of law to remain stable over long periods of time when you are a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial society. Very difficult to manage those kinds of novel, modern kinds of societies. And so it's a struggle, and it has international implications because liberal democracies have been the dominant force in world politics for the last 200 years. And so we are at a point where we're now asking the question, and this is when we start to come to the issue of US-China relations, how can liberal democracies put their house in order and become a force for, a constructive force for building global international order? And I would say that today, as a kind of together, these three world order crises, in many ways, haven't been evident in world politics for generations. Indeed, if you were to look historically for a period that looks like today, we might go back to the 1930s, when we saw the collapse of the world economy. We saw the existential struggle between different kinds of states, Imperial Japan, fascist Germany, communist Soviet Union, the United States and Britain, other countries, all of which were in a kind of global war for determining the nature of the future. And that was an extraordinary moment. The first, if you will, global struggle for what would international order look like. And in some sense, we are there today, not as dangerous, I would say. That's the good news. But we are at a moment where all the big questions are put on the table. Now, what do liberal democracies bring to global order building? I want to say a word about that before I turn to US-China relations. I want to say a little bit about why the crisis of the liberal international order is in some sense the prologue, the beginning of the struggle that we see today over what comes next. That it's been the failures of the Western liberal democracies to uphold and maintain their post-war system that has brought us to this point. And if I were to identify the sources of the breakdown of this American-led liberal international order, I would say that there are at least three recent sources. One was the Iraq War. In the United States, the Iraq War was a disaster. It was a disaster for the world, probably more generally, but it discredited internationalist elites that were important for American foreign policy in upholding a kind of global system. So it made the United States a source of problems rather than a source of solutions, and it discredited a group of internationalists who in earlier generations had been important in upholding global order. The second failure of the liberal international order was the 2008 financial crisis, which was an equally important moment when the world capitalist system, dominated by the United States and Western capitalist societies, failed to do their work and were in a position where they were not capable of managing global open markets. So the 2008 financial crisis discredited aspects of liberal internationalism as well, and made it look like the liberal international order was a basic neoliberal experiment a platform for capitalists and bankers to do deals. So there was a kind of discrediting of an open world order based on global capitalism. And in some ways, the third failure of liberal internationalism, seen at least in the United States, is the failure of the United States to navigate a transition of China into a global role of joint leadership. That there was in the 1990s and the period after that a kind of optimism that the world could converge, that China would join the WTO, that it would be part of a new kind of coalition of great powers dedicated to a common set of liberal international institutions. And on the basis of that convergence, there would be a kind of one world system where everyone would understand and operate within a shared legitimate international order. And that too has failed. Failed for reasons we may want to discuss today in our question and answer period, but failed in the sense that China and the United States now increasingly look as if they are embarked on different grand projects, that China has increasingly stepped out to articulate an alternative to liberal democratic order and liberal internationalism. And so we look as if today we are increasingly facing a kind of two-world system, a kind of bipolar system with alternative visions, and indeed alternative what are sometimes called modernity projects that are deeply rooted in culture, ideas, history, and divergent great power interests. Now, the next point I want to make is that when we think about that US-China divergence and conflict that is increasingly dominating world politics today, what do we make of the liberal democratic world that occupies, if you will, one part of that global conflict? And here I would say that there is a great deal that exists within that long history of liberal democratic order building that is still useful today. We've seen the crises and failures and lost opportunities of liberal international order, but we should also remember its accomplishments, and to remember that the liberal international order emerged in the 20th century in an effort to develop a post-imperial global system based on principles of order that were not imperial, that were in essence intergovernmental, that were in essence Westphalian in their foundations, that the global order would have at its deep, you might say, ontological foundation, nation states, self-determined units that would then occupy global space and negotiate over order based on sovereign equality. And so that is a post-imperial vision of order, and the liberal international order led by the United States, particularly after 1945, was in some sense an effort to build on that post-imperial order and create an order that would reinforce and strengthen liberal democracy and those who wanted to affiliate themselves with the liberal democratic world. So what did that world system do? Well, that world system did lots of things, and I'll just mention 7 accomplishments. And I'll call them the Super Seven, the 7 features of world order that have been brought into the modern world and into the contemporary world that were in some sense given birth to after 1945. Number 1, the opening of a world economy after the Great Depression, creating rules and institutions for the management of free trade and open investment and exchange. Finance, monetary, and trade liberalization, all of which were made possible through a form of multilateralism that we associated with first the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, and then the WTO, opening the world economy and creating an era of a kind of golden era of global economic growth. Secondly, this liberal order created a framework for the reintegration of Germany and Japan. Think about it. 2 fascist imperial states that were defeated in World War II, but very quickly became partners in building a global order around peace and cooperation. Even today, Germany and Japan do not have nuclear weapons. They have affiliated themselves with a joint system anchored in the United Nations and into the alliance system that the United States has provided for stable international order. Thirdly, France and Germany, who had been the source of world war for almost 2 centuries, buried their differences and launched the European Union. We forget how Europe is one of the great accomplishments of world politics over the last 100 years. They were the source of most of the great wars and certainly of the imperialism of the modern era. And now it is, as in the European Union, a kind of quiet anchor of peace and stability. We forget that. We also forget that there has been, in this period since 1945, the creation of multilateral rules and institutions like the world has never seen before. The IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, the WHO, arms control agreements, a creation of multiple environmental agreements, protocols and resolutions for the protection of endangered species, ozone abatement controls. There has been an incredible amount of work in building multilateral governance mechanisms since 1945 to help address our common problems. We forget about that. The next accomplishment is simply that we've been able to find a kind of structure so that states that have wanted to make transitions from authoritarianism and from, you might say, pre-modern market societies to a more modern form of social democracy. In Europe, in East Asia, in Latin America, in Eastern Europe, in Southern Europe, in Southeast Asia, in different countries around the world, you've seen a kind of framework for countries to find ways to modernize their states, to develop more social networks and social safety nets, creating opportunities for greater cooperation. Number 6, the liberal democratic world has created a home for the transition of states into more liberal democratic ways of operating. Think of South Korea, which in the 1980s was a military dictatorship, but found a way to establish democracy and join a system that allowed it to be safe and secure and prosper in the company of other countries like it. We forget about that, and we don't appreciate how important that cooperative structure is. And then finally, number 7, the last of my Super 7 achievements, if you will, is the creation of an open system that China could join in various ways. And so over the last 3 decades, China, by trading and investing with the outside world, has had many of its greatest decades in its long, multiple centuries history. Double-digit growth of China based on outward-oriented trade and investment, operating inside of a global capitalist world order. China has had its best decades in 2 millennia. So those are great, great achievements of order building. And so today here in Nepal, we're asking the question, what will the next world order look like? My point in what I've just talked about is, don't forget what we've done. That it's not something to throw away. That there are lessons and frameworks and platforms and foundations upon which we can build our next generation of international order. Now, let me just end by saying something more directly about US-China relations. I do think that we are in for very difficult times between the United States and China, because whereas 25 years ago, you would have said, China looks like they are making choices to open up their society and join a kind of common evolving world system. Today, for reasons we can debate, and there's probably blame on all sides, that's for sure. This is not a story of China simply going off the rails and giving up on liberalization, openness, and integration. But it is a story of diversion, of two different ways of thinking about how political and economic life should take place. And so the United States today under President Biden is in some ways making a message to the world that the United States would still like to play a global role in reinforcing and rebuilding international order, but it sees as its historic capacity for doing so driven by its commitment to strengthening and protecting liberal democracy. And that is an impulse that China doesn't share. And so there is going to be a conflict over what kind of values and what kind of principles are going to be put at the center of international order. And we are going to live a generation of struggle over that. The United States has seen its own 200-year history as part of a larger ascendancy of liberal democracies coming out of the 18th and 19th century age of democratic revolutions, building on a type of political system anchored in a series of characteristics that continue to be at the center of its value system. A free press, an independent judiciary, freedom of information, a civil society that is outside the reach of the state, the rule of law, competitive elections by political parties. So those are key characteristics of liberal democracy that the United States and other countries like it seek to protect and to create, if you will, a world that is safe for liberal democracy. And so that is always going to be at the center of the American engagement with China. And China is going to resist that because liberal democracy, in a certain sense, is threatening to countries that aren't liberal democracies. And so the question I will just leave our discussion with is there a possibility for us to build a global order where we can both compete and cooperate? I don't see a solution to the problem of ideological conflict. Indeed, I think that is going to grow, not decline. But I think we have to look for a way to make that competition as peaceful and constructive as possible. And this is where I'll just leave my remarks. Is there an agenda for the US and China to manage their differences and work together on problems that are truly global in interest? And here I would mention a couple things. Number one, I do think that there is a possibility of using the growing problem of global warming as a basis for building a working relationship between Beijing and Washington to find a way to collectively make big radical steps to push our economies towards a post-carbon future. The United States and China are the two greatest carbon emitters. China emits 27% of the global total, and the United States emits 15%. So together they are over 42% of global carbon emissions come from two countries. And so they have an unusual responsibility. And I think there is something there where they can find a way to cooperate. So I think that is number one. And number two, there is an entire new generation of military technologies that are going to increasingly make stable, peaceful, deterrence-based superpower relations difficult. And so not today, not tomorrow, but the day after tomorrow, we are going to have to start to think, what would a arms control and disarmament agenda look like for US-China? Remember that was key to the ending of the Cold War. Remember that the Soviet Union and the United States, despite their ideological differences and their bipolar competition, did in the final analysis find a kind of common ground on reciprocal-based arms control cooperation that began in the 1960s after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then of course picked up speed in the 1970s and the 1980s. And then the third area for US-China cooperation is for, this is again, not today, not tomorrow, but the day after tomorrow, China and the United States have an obligation to look again at the reforming of the United Nations, particularly the Security Council. Think about it. Wouldn't it be exciting if China and the United States could find a basis for cooperation on reform of the Security Council, inviting new permanent members, revising the veto, maybe abolishing the veto, inviting India, Japan, Brazil, South Africa. There are different ways for thinking about a United Nations that could be reformed. But I do think, despite the differences between China and the United States, and I think they are profound, I think nonetheless we can find an agenda for cooperation, and those are the three areas that I would: global warming, arms control, and reform of the United Nations. Thank you very much.
Professor John Ikenberry, thank you very much for the comprehensive presentation. It was really interesting and we learned a lot. I'm sure our audience also immensely benefited from it. We have received lots of questions, so without any delay, let me share the questions with you. So would you like to take question one by one, or you want me to club 2 or 3 in a group?
What have you found is most effective? Maybe if there's one question that you see as kind of overriding, then why don't you pose that one? But but if you think you can bundle them, I'll just take notes.
Then we can go for one by one, sir.
Okay.
So the first question is, international economy cannot be imagined without either the United States or China. In the present China-US Cold War-like situation, are likely to threaten international liberal world order, or a first step towards reorganization of the international order into greater integration of world economies. So how do you look at it? Like, international economy can be imagined without either the US or China. So is the present US-China Cold War-like situation likely to threaten international world order, or is it a first step towards reorganization of the international order into greater integration of world economies?
That's a great question. I think in some ways, neither of those options is likely. On the one hand, I don't think that a decoupling of our economies is possible or desirable, really. I don't think China wants it, and even though the United States is increasingly worried about Chinese state involvement in the economy and is deeply worried about China as a illiberal state. Think about what it's doing in Hong Kong, or what the treatment of minorities in Western China. There's a huge concern about China that has made it difficult for the United States to think about China as a truly legitimate great power that we can work with as a partner. So that's not likely, but the decoupling is very difficult to imagine. I think that there is likely to be a search for a kind of hybrid world system where we agree on basic rules of trade and investment, but increasingly carve out areas where we break with each other on areas where, for example, China state-owned enterprises are playing by different games than non-authoritarian state capitalist companies. So breaking areas away from the global multilateral system is increasingly going to happen. There will be much more what we call the securitization of economics. Increasingly, China, but so too the United States, is looking at trade and investment with China in terms of what are the security implications. So that's going to continue, but there is such a massive overlap in our economies. It's too late. As they say, the barn door is open and all the horses have run out. You can't put the horses back in the barn. It is a interdependent world economy. It can't be delinked, but it will increasingly be hybrid as there's an attempt to both reconcile some overlay of multilateral rules with areas that are going to be contested and divided.
Thank you, sir. Let me move to the next question. Is there a change in the liberal internationalist foreign policy of Democratic Party under President Joe Biden due to the legacy of previous administration of Donald Trump?
I think that's a great question. I think that Trump was a disaster for American foreign policy, and he was in some sense the antithesis of liberal internationalism. In almost everything he did, he attacked America's own historic foreign policy, commitment to free trade, multilateral institutions. Remember, he withdrew from the WHO in the middle of a pandemic. He withdrew from the Paris Accords. He insulted fellow democratic states, Germany under Merkel, Korea, disrespect for fellow democratic leaders while he cozied up to autocratic leaders, the failure to take seriously human rights, which, as I've said in my lecture, is deeply embedded in the American view of the world, going all the way back to the American founding. So in many ways, Biden is a return to the 75-year American playbook, going back to 1945, that the United States has a incentive to be influential on the world stage by tying itself to other countries. The word I use is binding, by binding itself to Europe, by binding itself to Japan, by binding itself to multilateral institutions. It becomes a more friendly, you might say user-friendly country. And that is Biden's worldview. He feels that very deeply. America has done a lot of bad things in the world, but it, on balance, in Biden's view and in my view, has been a force for good in the world. The last 75 years have been better for most of the world because of this liberal project of building a global, rule-based, open relationships. And I think Biden wants to reestablish America's credibility on the world stage by going back to that 75-year playbook.
Thank you, sir. Let me move to the third question. I'm trying to club 3 questions because it's almost similar. Like, America is back to bolster the liberal international order. Is there any specific strategy to counterbalance China and Russia? Second is it viable for the US to tackle with China and Russia both at the same time? And third is, do you see any possibility of a direct military confrontation between the US and China, or they would accommodate each other, taking into account the cost of the military confrontation? If so, what could that be?
Those are great questions, and they do go together. So let me answer them in turn. I do think that there is increasingly a China strategy. It's not quite what you think. It's not a containment strategy like the Cold War. As I said earlier, I don't think you can go back to a Cold War. It's not a zero-sum world anymore. China and the United States are too interconnected to have a kind of containment strategy. During the Cold War with the Soviet Union, the two systems were very separate. So they could, the idea of containing the Soviet Union had a kind of logical, logic to it. But containment is not what I would say is the American strategy towards China. It's competition for sure. And it's what I would call counterbalancing. It's trying to strengthen ties with countries that are closer to China, that are potentially threatened by China. And so think of the Quad with Japan, India, and Australia, and the United States. The Quad as a example of American strategy towards China. It's not directly trying to confront China, but it's trying to create weight, geopolitical weight among countries that want to have a region and a globe that is not dominated by China. So I think that's very much the core of American strategy of competition and counterbalancing. But I would say equally important is focusing on our own problems. You've heard me say today that there are lots of reasons why the United States is very worried about China. China has changed. China under Xi is not the China of Deng Xiaoping. It's a China that is much more threatening, I would say, to its own people, certainly to young people in Hong Kong who used to be people I hung out with, who are now either in jail or threatened. So China is not the China that the US was engaging in the 1990s. And so that's true. But the best way, I think, in the view of the Biden administration to compete with China and to show that the Chinese pathway of greater state control, use of security as a rationale for clamping down on civil society groups, and to kick out Western influences, because there's a sense that Western influence is dangerous to the Communist Party, control of the state, that the best way to counter that is to get your own country in order, to have a healthy democracy, to show the world that liberal democracies can work, that you can get your own house together, that you can make life good for your own people. So part of competition with China doesn't have anything to do with China. It has to do with getting your own societies to work better, to solve problems. So that, I think, is the great, that I think those two things, counterbalancing and getting your own house in order, are the two strategies of the Biden approach to China. If I were a geostrategist, I would say it's probably not great to take on China and Russia together, but I don't think you can. I think you have to at this point. I think you have to say that both China and Russia are seeking to undermine American influence and ideas in the world. That's just an empirical statement. Putin wants to see a smaller, weaker America. President Xi wants to see a smaller, weaker America. So I don't think you can get around the fact that both are rivals, and that if they get their way, America will be smaller and weaker. And that if in defending a open, rule-based, liberal, democratic-oriented world order, you just inevitably are going to have to knock heads with Putin and Xi. So I think you can't avoid responding to Putin when he puts opposition leaders in jail, uses his security offices to engage in assassinations outside of Russian territory. And so too with China. I think you just have to speak up, but do so in a way that you can keep the door open for pragmatic cooperation. The final question was about military conflict. And there is a big debate in the United States today about Taiwan. And there are pessimists and optimists about Taiwan in the foreign policy community in Washington. Some who say, we're coming up to the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, and there's a big celebration of the CCP, and there's a sense that China may be impatient about its relationship with Taiwan, and that technologically it is increasingly building up a capacity to use force, that if you put it, or to put it differently, that the deterrence that Taiwan has established for itself to dissuade China from using force to take over Taiwan is weakening, that deterrence is not what it used to be. So that's the pessimistic view. The more optimistic view is that it would just be utterly catastrophic for China if it used force against Taiwan. It would relegate China to a position in the global system where it would be impossible for it to even envisage being a global leader. It would be the global bad guy for generations. And So I can't imagine China making that calculation. And as the question said, the costs of using force against such a established political entity as Taiwan would be huge for both China and Taiwan and for the region. So it's not that, you know, the old saying that there's too much international economic interdependence for war to happen. I'm not making that argument, but I am making an argument that the cost to China for what it really would like to do it would be put at jeopardy if they were to actively invade Taiwan. Taiwan, I know that China doesn't like to hear this, but Taiwan is a democracy. I go to Taiwan. The people are very proud of their institutions of self-determination. We the people. And so that makes it harder for the United States and for other democracies simply to stand by and see Taiwan gobbled up like Hong Kong is being gobbled up. So I think there is a reason for restraint on the side of China. And so I'm cautiously optimistic that we can get through this next period without a war. Doctor, I can't hear you.
Sorry, can you hear me, sir?
Yeah.
Okay, so let me try to club 3 questions together. It's on post-COVID world order. First is that, do you think there was a failure on the part of global institutions like the United Nations, WTO, and recently WHO to protect the liberal international order? And there's another, do you foresee greater multipolar disorder in the coming years owing to increasing new Cold War violence between China and US in the post-COVID era? And third is also in similar lines, like what changes and reforms do you envisage in the institutions, regimes, and rules of the liberal international order? Do you want them to accommodate other regions of the world other than the West in decision-making process?
Those are great questions. Did the WTO and the United Nations contribute to their weakness, contribute to the crisis of the liberal international order? No, I don't think they were the reason for the crisis. Let me give you, I mentioned the 3 crises, well, you might say 4. Trump, who actively was every day waking up in the White House and trying to find ways to undermine the liberal order. So you had the most powerful man in the world trying to damage and sabotage the liberal international order. And he did a good job, but he failed. So that's number 1. The Iraq War was number 2. The 2008 financial crisis, number 3. The failure to successfully integrate China into the liberal order is number 4. And that was what I tried to argue were sources of crisis. There's one other deeper source that I want to mention, and that is the liberal international order during its golden era, from 1945 through the 1990s, was not a global order. It was an order of primarily countries that had grown out of the Cold War struggle with the Soviet Union. And of course, that was primarily at the core of the liberal order, Western Europe, North America, and Northeast Asia. And that order was not a global order. It was more like a club where you could join it. and so it was during the Cold War, called the Free World. And then after the Cold War, it was called the Liberal Order. But it was a club in the sense that to join it, you in some sense had to buy into a suite of responsibilities. To be inside was to get things, trade, security, tools for stabilizing your economy, solidarity with other countries to create stability. That's the club of the liberal order. But after the Cold War ended, everything became part of the liberal order. There was no other alternative. The Soviet club disappeared. And until Putin tried to rebuild the Soviet club, or now the Russian club, there wasn't an alternative. And so the club became just a fragmented, decentralized, poorly functioning international order. You didn't have to do anything to be in it. And as I said in my book, the liberal order started out as a club, and it ended up like a shopping mall or like a public utility where you could go in and get what you want and then leave with whatever you want, but you didn't have to contribute. You didn't have to buy into a set of rules. And China was like that. China got all the benefits of trade with the liberal international order, but it didn't have to buy into the norms and rules of the liberal international order. It was like China going into a shopping mall and going to some stores, but not going to other stores, and leaving when it got what it wanted. And so the liberal order broke down because it lost its club character. And I'm mentioning this because in some ways, the liberal or international order to function does have to be kind of exclusive. It has to have some value that people want to sacrifice to be in. Because if it's just, I get what I want and I don't have to give anything, then it's a very weak order. To put this point, to make a fine point on this, orders that don't have boundaries are weak orders. And the liberal international order lost its boundaries. It lost the logic of conditionality, and so it became weaker. And that leads me to the question about can the liberal order be larger than simply Western countries? And the answer is yes. It has to be. Otherwise, it won't survive. It can't be simply NATO. And it can't be simply NATO, Japan, and Korea. It needs to be something larger, because the world is not what it was in terms of the power of countries. And if the liberal order is to survive, it's going to have a larger coalition of countries. One proposal that has been debated was proposed by British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, called the D10, the Democracy 10, a kind of leadership group that would include the so-called G7, but also include South Korea, India, and Australia. Some have talked about wider groups, but the idea would be that the future of world order is basically who can build coalitions. And the bigger coalitions are going to be the winners in 21st century world order. And so there is an incentive for those who want to protect a critical mass of liberal democracies to make it a big coalition and not make it synonymous with Western history and Western countries, and for non-Western countries to take the lead, and for the story of the liberal international order to be written in Delhi, to be written in Jakarta, to be written in other capitals of the world, and to globalize it in a way that makes it more welcoming to everybody. And that means that the United States can still play a role. I hope it does, but it needs to, and I hope it will, see its future tied to a wider coalition. And that's very doable. I think that's very much what we're likely to see. And I remember I mentioned the Quad as an example of that kind of innovative coalition building.
Thank you, Professor. Here we come to the end of the program. Professor John Ikenberry, thank you once again for the wonderful discussion and valuable time. It was really a great learning session. We hope to have you again in future, maybe here in Nepal, in real, in Kathmandu. Thank you so much. I'd like to hand it over to Nice now.
Distinguished chair, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, as we have come to the end of this session, we would like to express a sincere gratitude and thanks to the chair for agreeing to chair and moderate the session today. Our sincere thanks also goes to all the speakers for being a part of the event and delivering such comprehensive and convincing presentations. We would like to acknowledge our gratitude to our friends from the diplomatic community, experts, academia, media, and different organizations. Finally, we must also mention our deep sense of appreciation for the audience who participated in the webinar and those who are watching us live. Thank you for your valuable time and attention and for making this session productive with your questions. Once again, we are truly honored to have you all with us today. Please do join us in the next session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much for your time. We're really honored to have you, sir. We hope to have you again.
I hope to join my son in coming to Nepal in the years ahead.
Thank you, sir. It will be an honor to host you here. Thank you.